At 4 a.m., Naomi Carter stood in her narrow kitchen, staring at three things on the counter: a past-due electric bill, a nearly empty bag of flour, and exactly $15 cash, tucked inside a crumpled envelope. She had just lost her part-time job. Her 8-year-old daughter had a school lunch payment due by Friday. The refrigerator held butter, brown sugar, and a few eggs, nothing else. There was no plan, no dream of building a business, no vision board on the wall. There was only a woman who had run out of options, reaching for the one thing she hadn't touched in years, her late mother's recipe book, and deciding to bake. That first batch came out of the oven just before sunrise. The smell of browned butter and toasted pecans filled every corner of the small house. It was the smell of a different life, one Naomi thought she had buried along with her mother. She had no idea what that single batch would set in motion. Months later, her phone rang, with an area code she didn't recognize: 501. Arkansas. The man on the other end introduced himself as a regional buyer for Walmart. And from that moment forward, nothing in Naomi Carter's life would ever look the same again. If you're new here, this channel is where we tell stories about real people who built something real from almost nothing. If that's the kind of story you want more of, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Naomi Carter was 34 years old, and she was used to making something out of nothing. She lived with her 8-year-old daughter Lily in a small rental house in Baton Rouge, the kind of place where the kitchen drawer stuck every single time, the bathroom faucet dripped through the night, and the wooden kitchen table carried more scratches than she could count. Naomi never let Lily see her look at that house with tired eyes. To her daughter, this was home, and Naomi intended to keep it that way, no matter what it cost her. She had worked as a cashier at a nearby convenience store for nearly 2 years. It wasn't much, but it was steady, and steady was what she needed. Then came the requests. Shift changes to pick Lily up from school when the aftercare program closed early. Schedule adjustments when the babysitter canceled without notice. Small accommodations that added up quietly in her manager's eyes until one Thursday afternoon she was told not to come back. Her ex-husband sent money when he remembered to. She had stopped counting on it a long time ago and had quietly rearranged her budget around its absence. Her savings account had a balance she could no longer bring herself to check without bracing first. The bills arrived in the mailbox with a regularity that felt almost mocking: electricity, rent, the school lunch account, the car insurance that she had been paying in half installments for 3 months. But what kept Naomi upright, what kept her moving from one day to the next without letting the weight show, was the way she managed to shield Lily from all of it. She packed her daughter's lunch before daylight. She read to her every night, even when her eyes were barely open. She kept her voice even when she was anything but. In Lily's world, her mother always had a plan, always found a way. Only alone in the kitchen after midnight, when the house was fully quiet, did Naomi allow herself to sit with the numbers and breathe through what she saw. She was not the kind of woman who dreamed about owning a business. She didn't watch entrepreneur videos or read books about abundance mindsets. She had no interest in the language of hustle culture. It felt like a costume she had never been offered in her size. The one thing she still carried with genuine pride from the years when she felt protected and loved was the ability to bake. It was a skill passed down directly from her mother Ruth, a woman who had been known throughout their Baton Rouge community for one thing above almost everything else: her brown butter pecan cookies. Every holiday gathering, every church potluck, every neighborhood repast after a funeral, Ruth showed up with a tin. People remembered her by the smell that drifted out of her small kitchen 2 hours before she arrived anywhere. Children on the street knew what it meant when they caught that particular scent of browned butter and toasted sugar coming through a screen door on a Saturday afternoon. After Ruth died, Naomi packed the recipe book into a shoebox and slid it to the back of the highest kitchen shelf. She didn't open it again. Not because she had forgotten the recipes she hadn't, but because every page was written in her mother's handwriting, and her mother's handwriting made the absence specific and real in a way that a general grief did not. Opening that book meant sitting alone with the particular feeling of being someone's child and no longer having that person in the world. Naomi wasn't ready for that. So the shoebox stayed on the shelf, and the shelf stayed out of reach, and the years moved forward without it. The notice arrived on a Monday morning, a yellow slip from the electric company tucked between a grocery store circular and a credit card offer she would never open. If at least a partial payment was not received within 7 days, service to the property would be disconnected. Naomi set it on the counter and stood there for a moment, reading it a second time, as though the words might rearrange themselves into something more manageable. Then Lily walked into the kitchen in her school uniform, rubbing her eyes, and asked in the casual, unhurried way that only children can manage, "Mom, what am I bringing for lunch tomorrow?" No complaint in the question. No awareness of what was sitting on the counter 2 feet away. Just a simple, reasonable request from a child who trusted that her mother had already thought about it. It landed harder than the notice had. Naomi looked at the crumpled envelope beside the bill. $15. She did the math she already knew the answer to, not enough to satisfy the electric company, not enough to restock the refrigerator properly, not enough to solve anything in any meaningful direction. She stood there long enough that Lily got herself a glass of water and wandered back to her room to finish getting ready. Then Naomi's eyes moved to the top shelf. The shoebox was right where she had left it. She pulled it down, set it on the counter next to the electric notice, and stood looking at it for a moment before lifting the lid. The recipe book was exactly as she remembered it, her mother's handwriting filling the pages in the same careful, unhurried script she had watched being written as a child. She turned to the brown butter pecan cookies without having to search. Her hands already knew the page. She started measuring at 11:30 that night, not with a plan, not with any particular hope. She baked because it was the one thing she knew how to do that could turn cheap ingredients into something worth more than their parts. And because standing at the counter with her mother's book open in front of her felt for the first time in a long time like being somewhere safe. The first batch came out of the oven at 10 minutes before 5 in the morning. The smell reached her before she opened the oven door, browned butter, deepening at the edges, toasted sugar, the warm, specific scent that she had not let herself think about in years. She stood at the counter and ate one cookie alone in the quiet kitchen, and for a few seconds she was not a woman with a past-due electric bill and $15. She was just someone standing in a warm kitchen, eating something her mother had taught her to make. A knock came at the back door. Her neighbor Evelyn, a retired schoolteacher in her mid-60s who lived alone in the house next door and had made a quiet habit of looking out for Naomi and Lily since they moved in, had seen the kitchen light on through her bedroom window and wanted to make sure everything was all right. Naomi waved her in, poured 2 cups of coffee, and pushed the plate across the table without explanation. Evelyn took one bite. She chewed slowly. She set down her coffee cup and put her hand over Naomi's on the table. "You're not just baking cookies, Naomi," she said. "You're sitting on something." Evelyn told her about the neighborhood weekend market, a community gathering held every Saturday in the church parking lot, 3 blocks away, where residents could sell homemade food, as long as ingredients were clearly labeled on the packaging. It had been running for 2 years. Some vendors made decent supplemental income from it. Naomi would be welcome to set up a table. Naomi listened. And even as she listened, the reasons to say no were already organizing themselves in her head with the quiet efficiency of thoughts that had been rehearsed before they were needed. The table fee was $20, and she had almost nothing left after buying ingredients. She had no printed packaging, No signage, nothing that looked deliberate or professional. Every table around her at that market would belong to someone who had prepared for this, who had labels and containers, and at minimum a cloth to cover the folding table. She would have brown paper bags and a handwritten marker. And beyond all the practical objections was the one she found harder to name. She did not want to stand in front of people she knew, neighbors, acquaintances, parents from Lily's school selling cookies from a folding table as though she were asking for something. She had spent the better part of 2 years managing the distance between her actual circumstances and what she let the world see. The market felt like that distance collapsing in public. She had nearly decided not to go. That evening, Lily came into the kitchen after dinner and sat down at the table without being asked. She pulled her box of colored markers toward her, took a flat piece of cardboard from the back of an empty cereal box, and began to write. Naomi was washing dishes and didn't pay much attention until Lily slid the finished sign across the table toward her. The letters were careful and oversized, the way a child writes when she wants to be sure she gets it right. Mom's brown butter cookies made with love. Lily didn't know about the table fee. She didn't know about the fear of being seen or the careful distance Naomi maintained between her real life and the version she showed the world. She only knew that her mother made something good and that good things deserved to be shared. The sign was not a suggestion. It was a statement of fact from someone who had not yet learned to doubt what she believed. Naomi looked at it for a long time. She borrowed $5 from Evelyn the next morning, bought the remaining ingredients she needed, and spent Friday evening baking 60 cookies and packing them into brown paper bags. She was at the market before the sun was fully up on Saturday, claiming the smallest available table near the back entrance. She set Lily's cardboard sign against the front edge and sat down in her folding chair. It was not a business plan. It was not a grand beginning. But it was the first real step, uncertain, imperfect, and entirely her own. The first morning at the market was nothing like she had imagined it. The tables around her made the contrast immediate. Her neighbors had printed vinyl banners, clear plastic clamshell containers that showed the product without requiring anyone to open anything, and small chalkboard signs with prices written in neat uniform lettering. One vendor had a card reader attached to her phone. Another had a matching tablecloth and a tiered display stand that made her table look like a photograph from a food magazine. Naomi had brown paper bags, a black marker, and a piece of cereal box cardboard propped against the front edge of a folding table borrowed from Evelyn's garage. People walked past. Some glanced. Most kept moving without breaking stride. One man picked up a bag, turned it over looking for a printed label, and set it back down without a word. A woman stopped and asked whether Naomi had a food handler's permit. Naomi opened her mouth, closed it, and said she was looking into it. The woman nodded with the careful politeness of someone who has already made up her mind and moved on. After nearly 2 hours under the morning sun, Naomi had sold 3 bags. She stood behind the table and let herself think the thought she had been keeping at arm's length since she unfolded the chair. Maybe the cookies were only special inside the family. Maybe outside of memory, outside of her mother's kitchen, and the specific weight of everything attached to that place, they were just cookies. Then Lily's second-grade teacher, Ms. Thompson, came around the corner of the market with a canvas tote over one shoulder. She recognized Naomi, stopped, and bought a bag, the warm, slightly obligatory purchase of someone who knows the seller personally and wants to be supportive. She smiled, said something kind, and kept walking toward the produce tables at the far end. 10 minutes later, Ms. Thompson came back. This time she had 3 colleagues walking with her. "I opened the bag in the parking lot," she said. "I gave everyone a piece. They want their own." Within 40 minutes, word moved through the market, the way it only moves when something is genuinely worth talking about. A man bought 4 bags to bring to his office on Monday. A woman asked if Naomi took orders for specific quantities. Someone photographed the cereal box sign and said they were going to post it. By the time the market closed, Naomi had 7 bags left. She sat in her car before driving home, the cash envelope held in both hands, and stayed there for a while without starting the engine. She counted the money twice, not because she doubted the amount, but because she needed to feel it being real. It was the first money she had ever earned entirely on her own terms. No manager, no clock-in, no one's schedule but her own. Just her hands, her mother's recipe, and 60 cookies that had started as a last resort and ended as a beginning. The weeks that followed moved faster than Naomi had expected or prepared for. A small coffee shop 2 blocks from Lily's school placed a standing weekly order, 100 cookies every Thursday morning, packaged and ready by 8. A group of parents from the school hired her for the end-of-year class party and referred her to 2 other parents who needed food for separate events. The Facebook page that Evelyn and Lily set up together, named Ruth's Kitchen Table, after a brief, serious negotiation between the 2 of them about what the right name should be, began collecting followers from neighborhoods Naomi had never sold in. Messages came in asking about shipping, about bulk orders, about whether she made other flavors. She had started baking to keep the lights on. Without planning it, she had started a business. Then the business pushed back. The complaint arrived as a formal written objection filed with the Weekend Markets Management Board. Another vendor, one with the printed banner and the tiered display stand, had raised concerns through official channels. Naomi's products lacked proper ingredient labeling. There were no visible expiration dates. The production kitchen had not been certified. The market's management sent Naomi a letter giving her 2 weeks to provide the relevant documentation or surrender her table. Naomi sat at her kitchen table that night, with the letter in front of her, and looked up every term she didn't recognize, which was most of them. What she found was not encouraging. To continue operating legally at her current volume, and certainly to grow beyond it, she needed a licensed commercial kitchen, a food handler's certification, product liability insurance, a registered business name, and packaging labels that met Louisiana's cottage food law requirements. Each item on that list had a cost attached to it. Each one required time she was already rationing carefully. She wrote the list out by hand on the back of an envelope and sat with it until the coffee in her mug went cold. This was the moment the question became concrete. She could scale back, keep the market table modest, decline the larger orders, stay within what she could manage in her home kitchen without documentation. That path was safer and immediately available. It was also a ceiling she could already see from where she was sitting, and it was low. Or she could treat this as a real business. File the paperwork, find a commercial kitchen, get certified. Build something capable of holding the weight of the demand that was already forming around her without her having planned for it. She thought about Lily asleep down the hall. She thought about the original reason she had pulled that shoebox down from the shelf. Not ambition, not a plan, but the specific desperation of a mother who needed to do something rather than nothing. And then she thought about what it would mean for Lily to watch her stop when the path became complicated. Naomi picked up the pen and started a second list. Everything she needed to do in order starting the next morning. The church 3 blocks from her house had a commercial kitchen in its fellowship hall, stainless steel countertops, 2 industrial ovens, a 6-burner range, and a ventilation system that cleared the air properly. The facility's director, a quietly efficient man named Gerald, agreed to rent her the space on Tuesday and Thursday evenings at a rate low enough to make it workable. The kitchen held its commercial certifications current. Naomi could operate legally out of it while she worked through the rest of her compliance paperwork. She arrived the first Tuesday with her mother's recipe book, her mixing bowls from home, and enough ingredients for 300 cookies. She had orders to fill by Friday. The first batch came out with burned edges and a raw center. She adjusted the temperature and ran the second batch. It spread too thin and browned unevenly across the pan, darker on the left side of the oven than the right. The third batch was structurally intact but dry. The texture was wrong in a way that was subtle enough that most people might not notice, but obvious enough that Naomi could not in good conscience put it in a bag with her mother's name attached to it. By 11 o'clock that night, she had worked through the majority of her ingredients and had nothing she could deliver. More than 200 cookies went into the trash. She sat down on the floor of the Fellowship Hall kitchen, back against one of the cold steel cabinets, and stayed there while the ventilation system cycled above her. The room smelled like burnt sugar and the accumulated cooking of decades of church suppers. Naomi looked at her flour-dusted hands and let herself think the thought she had been holding off for weeks. Maybe this is the edge of what I know how to do. Maybe I'm good at baking for my daughter in a small kitchen, and that's where it ends. She drove home after midnight without telling anyone how the evening had gone. She kissed Lily's forehead in the dark, made herself a glass of water, and sat at the kitchen table alone for a long time before she was ready to move toward the bedroom. She didn't open the recipe book with any particular intention. She opened it the way she sometimes did now, not to find a recipe, but because having it in her hands felt like company. She turned pages slowly until she reached the brown butter pecan cookie entry, and then her eyes moved to the margins the way they always did, checking her mother's handwritten notes. She had read this page more times than she could count. But she had never noticed the small notation written along the bottom edge in Ruth's tighter, more practical script, the handwriting she used when she was recording something useful rather than something personal. Large oven, reduce heat by 25 degrees, add 4 to 5 minutes, rotate pan halfway through. First time making for the church, took 3 batches to get it right. Naomi read it twice, then a third time. Her mother had stood in a large commercial kitchen, possibly this same fellowship hall, in this same building, 3 blocks away, and burned her first attempts too. She had made the same mistakes, worked through the same frustration, and figured it out the same way Naomi was figuring it out now. And she had written it down. Not to document her achievement. To make sure whoever came after her wouldn't have to begin from scratch. Naomi got up, found a pen, and wrote in the margin space below her mother's note. She recorded the actual temperature reading on the church oven's dial, the exact additional minutes her batches had needed, the precise point in the baking time when the pan needed to be rotated. Specific, practical, true. It was the first time she had ever added her own writing to her mother's book. The recipe was no longer just a record of what Ruth had made. It had become a conversation, one that had been waiting for Naomi to pick up her end of it. She closed the book and went to bed feeling something she hadn't expected, not solved, not relieved, but steadied, ready to go back on Thursday and try again. 3 months after the first Saturday at the market, Naomi was running something she still found difficult to name out loud, without feeling like she might jinx it. Several hundred cookies moved out of the church kitchen every week. The coffee shop order had grown from 100 to 150 units. 2 elementary schools had placed recurring orders for staff appreciation events. The Facebook page had cleared 800 followers. Her food handler's certification was framed and hung in the church kitchen next to Gerald's posted safety guidelines. Her business registration had come through. The product liability insurance was 3 weeks from being finalized. From the outside, it looked like progress. From the inside, it felt like running at a pace she was not certain she could maintain without something giving way. She was averaging 4 hours of sleep on a good night. She baked Tuesday and Thursday evenings at the church kitchen, delivered Wednesday and Friday mornings before Lily's school drop-off, ran the market table every Saturday, and answered messages in every gap between waiting in the school pickup line, sitting in the parking lot of the grocery store, during the 10 minutes after Lily fell asleep, before Naomi made herself go to bed. The work had become the texture of every hour, and there was no hour that didn't have some piece of it in it. The moment that broke through her managed calm came on a Thursday evening. Lily had asked to help with the labeling after dinner, the way she sometimes did, pulling a chair to the kitchen table and carefully pressing sticker labels onto brown paper bags, while Naomi sorted that week's orders into delivery groups. At some point after 10 o'clock, Naomi looked up from a stack of receipts and saw that Lily had fallen asleep at the table, cheek resting on her forearm, a half-labeled bag still loosely held in her hand. Naomi stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her daughter in the chair. This was exactly what she had been working to protect Lily from. The weight, the exhaustion, the feeling of being pulled into something relentless and adult. And here it was anyway, having found its way in through the side door of good intentions. She carried Lily to bed, came back to the kitchen, and sat down in the chair her daughter had just been sleeping in. She had been planning to talk to Evelyn that weekend about reducing her order volume, cutting back to a level she could manage without the hours bleeding into every part of the household. She was going to do that. She was ready to accept the smaller version of this if the smaller version meant Lily got her mother back at the dinner table. Her phone buzzed on the table. She picked it up without registering the number. "Is this Naomi Carter? I'm calling from Walmart's regional purchasing office. I hope I'm not catching you at a bad time." She didn't move. The man explained it methodically and without hurry. A store manager at a local Walmart had purchased her cookies at the Saturday market several weeks earlier. He had brought the product to a regional operations meeting as an example of a promising local vendor worth flagging. Someone at that meeting had passed it further along. The regional purchasing team had reviewed it. They were inviting her to present at a small business supplier showcase, a formal evaluation process for vendors being considered for placement in regional store locations. Then he read her the requirements list: retail-ready packaging with registered UPC barcodes, a full nutritional information panel compliant with FDA labeling standards, manufacturer certification documentation for her production facility, product liability insurance at a specified coverage threshold, a demonstrated and consistent supply capacity of 2,000 to 5,000 units per week upon acceptance into the system. The man finished. Naomi thanked him, told him she would be in touch, and ended the call. She was still sitting at the kitchen table in her own house in the chair where Lily had fallen asleep 20 minutes earlier. The house was quiet. The kitchen light was on. On the table in front of her were the sorted delivery bags, the receipt stack, and a near-empty roll of sticker labels. She looked at all of it for a long time, and for the first time since she had pulled that shoebox down from the shelf, Naomi Carter was not entirely sure she was the right person for what came next. She gave herself one night to sit with the fear. Then she opened her laptop. Over the next 3 evenings, working at the kitchen table after Lily was in bed, Naomi researched every item on the Walmart requirements list. She used the back pages of her order tracking notebook to keep the 2 sets of information separate. Retail packaging design. She found the realistic range of what a freelance designer would charge and wrote the numbers down without reacting to them. UPC barcode registration through GS1 annual fee setup, cost standard processing window. Nutritional panel laboratory testing through an accredited facility, cost per product per flavor variant. Commercial kitchen certification requirements for her arrangement with Gerald at the church fellowship hall. Insurance coverage at the specified threshold. And the supply capacity figure, which was not just a number, but an infrastructure question that touched every part of how she currently operated. More scheduled kitchen time significantly. More raw ingredient volume, additional labor she did not currently have, and a logistics framework she had been running entirely in her head. She added the costs up. Then she closed the notebook and sat with the number. The money was a serious problem, but it had edges. It was the kind of problem that could, in theory, be broken into steps and approached from multiple directions. She had learned over the past several months that problems with edges could be worked. What sat heavier than the financial column was the question she kept returning to in the quiet after midnight. If she handed her mother's recipe to a production facility, if she gave those instructions to people who had not grown up watching Ruth stand at a stove waiting for butter to turn exactly the right shade, would what came out of that facility still be the same thing? The brown butter had to be watched. The timing for folding in the pecans was specific. There were elements of that recipe that lived in practiced attention, not just in measurements written on a page. If those elements got lost in translation to an industrial process, then she was putting her mother's name on something her mother would not recognize. And that felt like a different kind of failure than any of the ones she had already survived. She had the email window open on a Tuesday night, the purchasing contact's address in the recipient field, the cursor blinking in the subject line, the opening sentence half-written. It was a polite decline. It cited capacity and timing. It was reasonable, and it was honest, and it was almost sent. Evelyn knocked on this back door at 8:30 that same evening, the way she did 2 or 3 times a week. She came in, sat down across from Naomi without being asked, and looked at the open laptop. She looked at the recipe book lying open beside it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "Your mother didn't leave you that book so you could keep it in a shoebox." Naomi looked up. "She left it so you'd have something to start with." Evelyn set her hands flat on the table. "Protecting her legacy doesn't mean keeping it small, Naomi. Sometimes protecting something means trusting it enough to let it go further and making sure it stays true while it does." Naomi didn't answer. She looked back down at her mother's handwriting on the open page and at her own handwriting in the margin below it from the night she had come home after the burned batches in the fellowship hall kitchen and found the note Ruth had left for exactly this situation. She closed the laptop without sending the email. She started with the one thing she could control, finding the right production partner. Over 4 days, Naomi called 8 small bakeries and contract production facilities within reasonable distance of Baton Rouge. She did not lead with price or volume requirements. She asked one question first: were they willing to work with an independent vendor, bringing her own recipe, with the expectation that she would remain actively involved in the production process rather than simply handing off the formula and stepping back? 6 of the 8 either declined outright or stopped returning calls after the first conversation. A 7th was interested, but named a minimum order volume that was beyond what she could commit to at her current stage. The 8th was a small family-run facility on the outskirts of the city operated by a woman named Sandra, who had run her own retail bakery for 11 years before transitioning to contract production work. Sandra asked Naomi to come in and bring something for her to taste. Naomi brought the recipe book and a tin of cookies she had made the previous night. Sandra ate one cookie, standing at her production counter, chewing slowly, and without the performance of enthusiasm the way a person eats when they are actually evaluating something, rather than being polite. Then she said, "I can work with this, but you'll need to be here for the first several runs." Naomi was there for every run for the next 2 weeks. She stood at the production mixer and watched the butter browning stage with the same focused attention she gave it in her own kitchen, stopping the process at the specific color and smell that she knew from years of watching her mother do the same thing. She adjusted the oven temperature on the first day. She changed the folding sequence for the pecans on the 3rd. She pulled a full tray from the line midway through the 2nd week and asked Sandra to stop the batch because the texture on the underside was 2 shades darker than it should be. Sandra recalibrated without argument and ran it again. By the end of the second week, what was coming out of Sandra's facility was not identical to what came out of Naomi's home oven. There were differences that only someone who had made these cookies for years would be able to name. But it was honest. It carried the browned butter depth, the weight in the hand, the thing that had made Ms. Thompson turn around in a parking lot and come back with colleagues in tow. Naomi could stand behind it. That was the standard she had set, and it was the only standard that mattered. While the production process was being refined, she found a recently graduated freelance designer named Patrick through a referral from one of the coffee shop's regular customers. Patrick agreed to work on a phased payment schedule, which made the arrangement possible. They met at the coffee shop that carried her standing weekly order, and Naomi told him the full story, the $15, the shoebox, the cereal box sign that Lily had made with colored markers, the fellowship hall kitchen floor, the phone call from Arkansas. Patrick listened without interrupting. When she finished, he turned his notepad toward her and wrote 2 words, Ruth's Kitchen Table. Below the name, a single line in smaller lettering. Started with $15 and a family recipe. Naomi looked at it without speaking for a moment. Then she nodded. When she walked into the Walmart supplier showcase several weeks later, she did not attempt to present herself as something larger than she was. She opened with the true story, the 4 a.m. kitchen, the $15 in a crumpled envelope, the daughter who made a sign out of a cereal box, the batches that burned on the fellowship hall floor, the margins she had filled in her mother's recipe book, the costs she had learned to calculate on the backs of the utility envelopes that used to be the only paper on her counter. She told it plainly and without apology, not because she was trying to manufacture sentiment, but because the story was the reason the product existed and the most accurate explanation of why it was different from anything else they were likely to see that day. Then she laid out what she had prepared. Finished retail packaging with registered UPC barcodes, a complete FDA, Compliant Nutritional Information Panel manufacturer, certification from Sandra's facility, current proof of insurance, a wholesale pricing structure with margin analysis, a phased supply capacity, commitment with specific weekly unit numbers attached to each phase, and a delivery logistics outline that accounted for her current production constraints. Honestly, the regional buyer tasted a cookie. He set it down. He picked up the packaging and read the back panel in full. Then he asked about shelf life under standard retail storage conditions, about first-phase supply guarantees, about whether the price point could hold stable as volume increased. Naomi answered every question, clearly, with specific numbers, without hedging on the things she knew and without pretending certainty about the things she was still working toward. She was not the woman who had stood behind a borrowed folding table near the back entrance of a church parking lot, hoping people would stop and look. She was the person who had built this from $15 and a shoebox, and a choice made alone in a dark kitchen, and she understood it more completely than anyone else in that room. Walmart agreed to pilot Ruth's Kitchen Table cookies in a selection of regional store locations, with a formal performance review scheduled at 90 days. A few months after the supplier showcase on an unremarkable Saturday afternoon, Naomi drove to a Walmart store 12 minutes from her house. Evelyn rode in the passenger seat. Lily sat in the back with her seatbelt twisted the way it always was, sneakers leaving small scuff marks on the back of the front seat, the way they always did a library book open in her lap. Naomi hadn't told either of them exactly why they were going. She said she needed to pick up a few things. Evelyn raised one eyebrow and said nothing. Lily didn't look up from her book. They walked through the main entrance past the greeting station and the shopping cart corral into the wide fluorescent interior that smelled the way every Walmart smelled, a specific combination of packaged goods and recycled air that Naomi had walked through hundreds of times in her life without once thinking it would ever mean anything particular to her. She led them toward the snack and bakery aisle at a pace that was deliberately unhurried. Evelyn was talking about something, a church committee matter, a neighbor's recent news, and Naomi was half listening, watching the shelves as they moved down the aisle. Lily stopped walking first. She had spotted it before anyone pointed it out, before anyone said a word. She stood in the middle of the aisle and stared. Then she walked toward the shelf slowly, with the careful approach of a child who isn't entirely certain that what she's seeing is real. She reached out and touched the edge of the packaging with 2 fingers lightly, the way you touch something you don't want to disturb. "Mom." Her voice was different from her regular voice, quieter. "Is this actually ours?" Naomi stepped up beside her daughter. Between 2 larger national brands in the space, a regional buyer had decided to give 90 days to prove itself, set a package of Ruth's Kitchen Table cookies. The craft paper packaging, the clean lettering, the single line beneath the name in smaller type started with $15 and a family recipe. "It's not just ours," Naomi said. She put her hand on Lily's shoulder. "It's Grandma Ruth's. It's mine. And it's yours too." Lily stood there for another long moment, turning the package over in her hands and reading the back panel with the focused expression she used for schoolwork she wanted to get right. Evelyn stood slightly behind them both. When Naomi glanced back at her, the older woman pressed her lips together and nodded once, the particular nod of someone who has been watching something difficult and good unfold over a long time and does not need to say anything more about it. That evening, Naomi returned to her kitchen. The drawer still stuck. The table still had its scratches. The faucet in the bathroom still dripped in the rhythm she had long since absorbed into the background of ordinary life. Nothing about the kitchen had changed, and she was glad for that. It was still the place where the story had started, the counter, the crumpled envelope, the shoebox on the high shelf. It was the same kitchen. She was not entirely the same person who had stood in it at 4 a.m. with $15 and no plan, but she was the same person in all the ways that mattered. She opened the recipe book to the brown butter pecan cookie page and laid it flat on the counter. She read her mother's instructions, then her mother's margin note about the large oven, then her own handwriting below it from the night she had come home from the fellowship hall, and understood what the note was for. 3 layers of the same conversation written across years in the same book. She found a pen and turned to the last page, the one that had always been blank, as though Ruth had left it intentionally. She wrote in the space at the top of the page, "For Lily, so you always know where we began." Then she closed the book, turned the oven on, and started measuring butter into the pan. Not for Walmart. Not for an order or a delivery window or a 90-day performance review. She baked that batch for the 3 of them herself, Lily and Evelyn, to eat at the scratched kitchen table before the evening was over. Because in the end, what had changed Naomi Carter's life was not a phone call from a 501 area code. It was a single moment alone in a quiet kitchen before sunrise when she decided that $15, her mother's handwriting, and whatever courage she had left was enough to begin. That's the story of Naomi Carter and Ruth's Kitchen Table cookies. If it stayed with you, if you've ever stood at your own version of that kitchen counter, wondering whether what you have is enough to share this with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want more stories like this one, subscribe, and we'll bring you another one soon. We'll see you next time.